Hi, class. I'd like to talk to you today about gas exchange, as this is a great example of how your cells work in exchange with the environment. Um, what we're going to do today is just go over some basic concepts that connect the uh, the topics we have learned about to another practical example, which is your body and a specific organ system called your respiratory system. So we're going to spend a few minutes today looking at this organ system and how our topics have connected to that. And then you will get a chance to study for your vocabulary quiz and your test, which you have next week. So let's get started. First thing I'd like to emphasize is that gas exchange does occur in our cell tissues, and it occurs under the same rules of diffusion that we talked about in class. Gases diffuse from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, the same way molecules move from an area of high concentration to low concentration in our bodies, or in the solutions we were studying in class. Um, that is done by partial pressure forces, but what you really got to realize is that gases are diffusing from a high to a low concentration. Okay. Animals can use one of two mediums in order to get oxygen from their environment. They can either use air or water. We're going to talk about water first. Both of these mediums allow for movement of molecules from high to low concentration because they're both fluid. They both possess molecules that are moving around. Okay. Animals use large areas that have large moist surface areas that have a lot of surface area to work with for gas exchange because that increases the amount of gas that can cross from the outside of the environment to the inside of the organism. These respiratory surfaces can vary, which can consist of outer surface skin or gills. They can also be related to us and have a trachea and lungs. And these are just some of the different respiratory surfaces animals can have. If we focus on a few of these, we could start by looking at gills, which are outfoldings of the body and creates large surface areas for mostly aquatic organisms to do gas exchange. The marine worm here has external gills, which are thin and help the organism do gas exchange. Crayfish have gills underneath of their exoskeleton, and sea stars have gills that line their appendages, which help them breathe underwater. This is where oxygen and CO2 can be exchanged, and how the organism can breathe. Other aquatic animals can move water over their gills using ventilation by taking in water and flushing it through their gills. By doing that, they allow oxygen in the water to move into their blood vessels, which is their body. The way it's able to do that is kind of interesting. We'll look at this a diagram over here as an example. As water flows through the gills and over the blood vessels, it's always at a higher concentration. Oxygen is always at a higher concentration outside of the blood vessels of the fish. And so as water flows over the gills, water or oxygen at a high concentration is always flowing into the body of the fish from an area of high to low concentration. That's a very good example, I would think, of how um, animals can exchange gas with their environment. Lungs are another way in which organisms can do this. They're an infolding of the body's surface. They're also connected to the circulatory system. The reason why organisms have lungs and gills, the point of thinking about this, is that not all of their cells touch the environment. and so they cannot do gas exchange with the environment if they're a large multicellular organism. Large multicellular organisms need a way to connect the cells inside their body with the outside environment so that they can exchange gas, and lungs and gills help organisms do that. Here would be a good model of our lungs. Here's some close-up of alveoli, which are air sacs in our lungs. As we take in air in our lungs, the air we intake has a very high concentration of oxygen. And as that sits in our alveoli, the oxygen at a high concentration flows into our blood vessels, which is at a low concentration. This is only able to happen because the cell membranes in our alveoli are so thin and oxygen is nonpolar. So those molecules can sneak right through the membrane into blood vessels, and because of the thin nature of those two membranes, oxygen can flow into our vessels easily and move throughout the rest of our body where it is needed. Carbon dioxide is also going to diffuse out of our capillaries, out of our blood vessels, into our alveoli, and out of the body. Okay. The process of breathing helps us ventilate our lungs. The part of our body that actually helps us do that is our diaphragm. As our diaphragm contracts, it expands our lungs, it expands our rib cage. By creating more volume and expanding, air basically rushes into our lungs and fills up that volume. Uh, by doing that, oxygen-rich air can rush in and then diffuse into our body. The relaxed diaphragm actually constricts our lungs and reduces the volume available for air and other particles in the environment. That allows CO2 to be exhaled out because our rib cage is smaller. I mentioned this in class, but this is also another cool thing to think about and point to. As we talk about homeostasis and we think about our body at a normal state, think about our blood and our oxygen to CO2 ratio in our blood. Blood pH is normally 7.4, which is pretty normal. However, if we for some reason increase the amount of activity in our bodies, or their breathing rate starts to slow down, the pH in our blood can actually drop, which makes our blood more acidic. That's due to the rising level of CO2 in our body and in our tissues. That cues our heart to start pumping faster so that we can move some of that CO2 out of our body into our lungs. But it also cues the brain to send signals to our diaphragm to start breathing faster. So what this really does is it increases our heart rate and increases our breathing rate. By doing those two things, we're able to take in more oxygen, eliminate more CO2, which lowers the CO2 level in our blood and raises our pH up back to 7.4, which is normal homeostasis. This is really important for our body because we need to maintain homeostasis at all times, and our circulatory system and our respiratory system help us do that. Organisms have a few different adaptations that help them perform gas exchange. We'll review our body one more time before we leave this concept. If we think about the air we take in, the air we take in has high concentration of oxygen, which exists in our lungs. That diffuses into our blood vessels and moves throughout our body. If oxygen's at a high concentration, when it gets to our tissues, it will diffuse through the thin capillaries near our tissues and into our body tissue, which uses the oxygen for cell respiration. In our body tissues, the CO2 would have built up, and at a high concentration, it will diffuse naturally into our blood. through capillaries, which are very thin. At a high concentration, the CO2 will return back to the lungs and eventually diffuse into the alveoli airspace, where it can be exhaled out through your trachea and through your mouth. All of this is only possible because of the thin nature of the cell membranes, the nonpolar nature of the gas molecules, and the basic laws of diffusion. This is what that molecule looks like that carries that oxygen and CO2 around the body. It's called hemoglobin, and it is attached to all of your red blood cells. Hundreds of proteins are attached to every single one of the red blood cells you have in your body. One last thing to mention, which is kind of cool, diving mammals have very cool adaptations where they're able to increase the amount of blood cells compared to their body volume. That helps them store excess oxygen. Myoglobin, which is a different protein, also can help mammals that dive deep underwater stockpile extra oxygen for later so that they don't run out and they can stay underwater longer. Okay, so with all that being said, um, that's it for our cells unit. I would recommend that you spend the rest of the time studying your vocabulary words and making flashcards, or maybe even labeling the text or your coloring guide with some of those vocabulary words. You should work together and study together and try and master those words. Another way you might try and study the vocabulary words would be to take words from that word bank I listed yesterday and try and create sentences with one or two or three of the words in them and see how much understanding you have while you make those sentences. If you find some words that you're really struggling with, star those and we can review those on Monday before our quiz, or you can come and see me in the morning on Monday and I'd be happy to help you review some of those words. Um, if you finish studying for your vocab quiz, I've given the sub an extra study guide that you might try. It has all the major themes that are going to be on Tuesday's test. And as you take a look at that study guide, you should find answering the questions pretty easy. If you have any trouble doing that, save those questions or star those questions and we can go over them on either Monday or maybe even through email if you'd like to post some questions there. Um, good luck studying. Your test on Tuesday will be over the topics on the study guide. I will post a more thorough study guide on Classroom later when I get a chance to. Use this topic along with the vocab words to really review the things we've gone over this entire unit. And if you run into any questions, feel free to ask your substitute, as she is also a biology teacher, or you could email me questions or save questions for me later when I get back. I hope you have a great day and a great weekend, and thanks for listening.